All rise. Cosmic Court is now in session. The Honorable Universe presiding. This court does not exist to predict fate. It exists to expose the patterns quietly shaping it. The court is a mirror, not a throne. Tonight's proceedings concern emotional avoidance, strategic self-preservation, and the hidden ways people delay their own transformations. The first defendant may approach the bench. Justice, known throughout the mortal realm as Libra. The defendant enters the courtroom composed, articulate, aesthetically coordinated, and emotionally exhausted. The court notes a long-standing pattern of maintaining external harmony while internally negotiating collapse. Justice appears calm. Internal records suggest otherwise. Justice, you stand before this court charged with the following offense: emotional self-abandonment through strategic delay. Additional charges include conflict suppression, chronic over-accommodation, and repeatedly betraying inner truth in order to preserve emotional equilibrium. The court submits evidence that the defendant has spent excessive time attempting to reach emotionally painless conclusions. Witness testimony confirms prolonged hesitation, endless internal negotiations, and repeated requests for more time long after the soul rendered its verdict. The defendant claims this behavior reflects maturity, but the court suspects fear. The court has further observed repeated attempts to beautify situations that should have been abandoned entirely. Instead of leaving emotionally draining environments, the defendant softened language, explained away disrespect, minimized disappointment, and negotiated with red flags. The court would like to remind the defendant, peace maintained through self-erasure is spiritually unstable. The court has reviewed the internal records. This was never confusion. This was guilt. The defendant feared disappointing people, disrupting emotional equilibrium, or being perceived as the villain. So instead of choosing freedom, justice chose prolonged emotional suspension. Unfortunately, under cosmic law, indecision is still a decision. Justice is found guilty of repeatedly abandoning inner truth in exchange for external harmony. However, the court acknowledges these behaviors began as survival strategies. The defendant learned early that keeping the peace often felt safer than risking rejection. But survival patterns that once protected the self can eventually imprison it. Sentencing is as follows. The defendant is hereby ordered to stop negotiating personal needs into non-existence. The court further orders immediate emotional decluttering, clear decision-making, and the release of relationships sustained solely through self-sacrifice. Justice is ordered to say what they actually mean the first time. The defendant is additionally prohibited from rereading conversations like prophecy scrolls. One uncomfortable decision must be made within the next 24 hours, and the court strongly recommends boundaries that are not written in invisible ink. The court further reminds the defendant, endless refinement in order to avoid visibility shall henceforth be recognized as procrastination with better lighting. Justice, you were never designed to disappear in order to be loved. Verdict entered. Case temporarily adjourned. The court now calls its second defendant, Ferdinand, known to the mortals as Taurus. The defendant enters the courtroom visibly calm and spiritually immovable. The court notes repeated resistance to internal change despite overwhelming external evidence demanding it. Ferdinand continues insisting stability is the priority, while quietly confusing familiarity with safety. Ferdinand, you stand before this court charged with the following offenses: emotional stagnation, defensive attachment to comfort, and repeated refusal to release expired emotional infrastructure. The court submits evidence that the defendant has continued preserving routines, relationships, and environments long after emotional expiration. Witness testimony confirms the subject repeatedly saying, "It's fine," while visibly dying inside. The court has observed repeated avoidance of necessary emotional risk. The defendant claims caution, but the court suspects fear disguised as practicality. Ferdinand continues attempting to maintain peace through emotional numbness, physical comfort, and strategic denial. Unfortunately, ignoring collapse does not stop collapse. Ferdinand is found guilty of remaining emotionally stationary while expecting life to transform around them. The court acknowledges the defendant values stability. However, a cage lined with velvet remains a cage. The defendant is hereby ordered to discontinue romanticizing emotional stagnation. Immediate energetic decluttering is required, and the court strongly advises the release of attachments sustained solely through habit. Ferdinand is ordered to throw away at least one emotionally haunted object. The defendant is additionally prohibited from calling avoidance protecting my peace. One uncomfortable but necessary action must be completed before the next lunar cycle. Ferdinand, comfort was never meant to become your identity. Verdict entered. Case temporarily adjourned. The court now calls its third defendant, Castor and Pollux, known throughout the mortal realm as Gemini. The defendants enter the courtroom simultaneously. Mentally overstimulated, emotionally evasive, and somehow already halfway through 3 additional conversations. The court notes severe cognitive fragmentation and repeated attempts to outrun emotional processing through movement, distraction, and excessive mental activity. Castor and Pollux, you stand before this court charged with the following offenses: identity fragmentation, chronic emotional deflection through intellectualization, and reckless overconsumption of stimulation. The court submits evidence that the defendants have attempted to think their way around emotions instead of experiencing them. Witnesses report excessive joking, topic shifting, and abrupt personality pivots whenever discomfort approaches. The defendants continue confusing motion with progress. The court has observed unfinished projects, unanswered emotional realities, and approximately 17 open mental tabs. Castor and Pollux repeatedly seek external stimulation whenever silence threatens self-confrontation. Unfortunately, the court has ruled that constant distraction does not legally qualify as healing. The defendants are found guilty of using intelligence as emotional camouflage. The court acknowledges the brilliance of the Gemini mind. However, awareness without embodiment remains incomplete. The defendants are hereby ordered to sit still long enough to hear their own thoughts finish forming. The court additionally orders temporary reduction of unnecessary stimulation and immediate emotional follow-through. Castor and Pollux are prohibited from opening new emotional storylines before resolving existing ones. The defendants must complete one unfinished task before beginning another, and the court strongly advises experiencing at least one difficult emotion without converting it into a joke. Castor and Pollux. Not every silence requires escape. Verdict entered. Case temporarily adjourned.